August 30th, 2021, 11:59 p.m., Kabul, Afghanistan. The night air is thick with the smell of jet fuel and the dust of 20 years. On the tarmac, the silhouette of a C17 Globe Master 3 looms like a prehistoric giant. Its massive form dominates the frame. Major General Chris Donahue, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, walks toward the ramp. He is the last American soldier to leave Afghan soil. Behind him, the city is a mosaic of muzzle flashes and celebratory tracer rounds, ahead of him is the end of an era. 2 decades earlier, this moment was unimaginable. The United States had entered this rugged landscape with a sophisticated military machine. They came to hunt the architects of 9/11s and stayed to rebuild a nation. As the heavy cargo door seals shut, the silence is deafening. It is the sound of a superpower closing a chapter that cost trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of lives. If intelligence had been clearer in the 1990s, or if the focus had never shifted to Iraq in 2003, would this ramp have closed differently? Was the mission doomed by the geography of the Hindu Kush, or by the shifting sands of political will in Washington? This is not just a story of a war. It is a chronicle of how the world's lone superpower exerted its maximum strength against an invisible enemy, only to find that in the mountains of the graveyard of empires, time is the deadliest weapon of all. The Twin Towers fell on a crisp Tuesday morning, and with them, the old world order collapsed. The machinery of American power was pivoting. The United States was no longer a nation of peace. It was a wounded titan. The political climate was one of unprecedented unity. For a brief window, the internal fractures of American politics vanished, replaced by a singular, cold determination, retribution. Economically, the turn of the millennium had seen the U.S. at its zenith. The budget was in surplus. The technology boom was accelerating. The military was a next-gen force, designed for high-intensity conflict against peer states. It was built to destroy tanks on the plains of Europe, not to hunt insurgents in caves. Yet, the military balance of power was so lopsided that the outcome seemed a foregone conclusion. The Taliban, a fundamentalist militia governing a fractal, impoverished nation, stood no chance against the Tomahawk cruise missile and the Predator drone. War became unavoidable because the global psyche had been scarred. The ultimatum to the Taliban was simple: hand over Osama bin Laden or share his fate. When they hesitated, the gears of the Pentagon ground into motion. It was the first time NATO's Article 5 was invoked. The world was on the brink of a new kind of conflict, the global war on terror. At the heart of this storm were men of immense conviction and staggering complexity. George W. Bush, the decider, viewed the conflict through a moral lens. His strength was his clarity of purpose. His flaw was perhaps an underestimation of the cultural complexities of the region. Beside him stood Donald Rumsfeld, a Secretary of Defense obsessed with transformation. He wanted a lean, mean, high-tech military. He believed that small numbers of special forces, paired with devastating air power, could achieve what Soviet divisions could not. On the other side stood Mullah Omar, the reclusive, one-eyed leader of the Taliban. He was a man of the shadows, a rural cleric who believed he was doing the will of the divine. His strategy was ancient: patience. He understood that the Americans had the watchers, but his people had the time. He needed only the loyalty of the tribes and the unforgiving terrain of the borderlands. The strategic buildup was a masterpiece of logistical audacity. The United States didn't just invade. They orchestrated a symphony of unconventional warfare. CIA officers dropped into the Panjshir Valley with suitcases filled with millions of dollars in cash. They didn't need an army yet. They needed the Northern Alliance, a group of Afghan rebels who had been fighting the Taliban for years. The geography of Afghanistan is a nightmare for any invader. It is a fortress of rock, dominated by the Hindu Kush mountains, where peaks rise to 20,000 feet and valleys are isolated by snow. There are no navigable rivers, no coastline, and precious few paved roads. To win here, the U.S. utilized the jawbreaker teams. They bypassed the traditional slow buildup of troops and instead used laser target designators to call down the wrath of God from B-52s. It was a fusion of 19th century cavalry and 21st century precision. By late October 2001, the mobilization was complete. The world watched as the most advanced air force in history began systematically dismantling the Taliban's air defenses, which were virtually non-existent in their command centers. The deception was in the speed. The Taliban expected a slow, methodical, Soviet-style ground invasion. Instead, they got the horse soldiers, green berets on horseback, charging across the plains of Mazar-e-Sharif, calling in GPS-guided bombs that obliterated entire front lines before the enemy even heard the jets. The turning point of the initial phase came at Tora Bora in December 2001. The remnants of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban were cornered in a complex of caves near the Pakistani border. This was the moment the war could have ended. Bin Laden was within reach. But here, the first major tactical failure occurred. Relying on local militias to seal the border rather than deploying a massive American ground force allowed high-value targets to slip away into the lawless tribal areas of Pakistan. The snake had been bruised, but the head remained intact. As the years bled into a decade, the mission shifted. What began as a counter-terrorism strike evolved into nation-building. This was the psychological shift that changed the nature of the battlefield. American soldiers were no longer just warriors. They were governors, engineers, and trainers. They built schools, paved roads, and attempted to instill a democratic framework in a land where loyalty is traditionally owed to the tribe, not the state. The tactical maneuvers became a deadly game of cat and mouse in the green zones of Helmand and Kandahar. The IED became the Taliban's equalizer. A 50-cent pressure plate and an old jug of fertilizer could disable a multi-million-dollar MRAP. The communication failures were not technical, but cultural. The Hearts and Minds campaign often struggled against the night raids, which were tactically successful but strategically damaging to trust. By 2011, the peak of the surge, there were 100,000 American troops in the country. They were winning every firefight. They were clearing every valley. But as soon as they left to secure the next village, the shadow government of the Taliban returned. It was a war of inkblots that refused to spread. The surprise element was the resilience of the insurgency, which drew support from sanctuaries across the border, creating a strategic stalemate that bled the American treasury and tested the patience of the American public. The aftershocks of the two-decade conflict are still being felt across the geopolitical landscape. The human cost was staggering. Over 2,400 American service members killed, and over 20,000 wounded. The Afghan security forces and civilians suffered losses in the tens of thousands. Financially, the price tag exceeded $2 trillion, a sum that could have rebuilt American infrastructure 10 times over. The political fallout was equally severe. The war spanned for presidencies, each inheriting a conflict that had no clear exit strategy. The Doha Agreement of 2020, signed between the US and the Taliban, set the stage for the final withdrawal. It was a controversial treaty that excluded the Afghan government, effectively signaling that the American era in Afghanistan was coming to a close. When the final collapse of the Afghan National Army occurred in the summer of 2021, the speed of it shocked the world's intelligence agencies. The critical mistake, the one that historians will debate for centuries, was the lack of a consistent, unified strategy. The US military is the finest instrument of war ever devised, but it was asked to perform a task that was essentially political and social. Overconfidence led to mission creep. By trying to turn Afghanistan into a centralized, Western-style democracy overnight, the coalition ignored reality. We tried to build a skyscraper on a foundation of sand, and we did so while our eyes were often turned toward the brewing storm in Iraq. Yet, the legacy of the war is not merely one of loss. It was a showcase of American ingenuity and the unbreakable spirit of the American soldier. The innovations introduced from unmanned aerial vehicles to advanced battlefield medicine have redefined modern combat. The longest war taught a new generation of leaders the limits of kinetic power and the absolute necessity of cultural intelligence. Today, the valley of the Korangal is quiet. The outposts of the Hindu Kush are reclaimed by the wind. The American presence has faded, but the impact remains. The war proved that the United States would go to the ends of the earth to protect its citizens, demonstrating a reach and a resolve that no other nation can replicate. But it also stands as a haunting reminder that even the most powerful hammer cannot always shape the hardest stone. The images of the final C-17 lifting off into the midnight sky over Kabul remain burned into the global consciousness. It was a moment of profound transition. The war didn't end with a signed surrender on the deck of a battleship. It ended with a quiet departure in the dead of night. As the roar of the engines faded over the mountains, it left behind a nation once again under the shadow of the Taliban, and a superpower forever changed by the dust of a land that refuses to be tamed. The ghosts of the Hindu Kush still whisper to those who would seek to conquer them, a reminder that in the theater of war, the final act is rarely written by the one who fires the first shot.